Lucia Corso here with our weekly episode of Dialogues with Interesting People. I changed the subject of this week, sorry, but we'll resume with the vocalization next week. Today I'm talking about a question that was a topic really hot some time ago. I don't know now if it is still. It is on the Adele issues question. I don't know if you know, she had problems at the vocal cords. She had to had a surgery. She took some time off. Then she came back and she took some other time off. Now she's doing the residencies, and the declaration in the ears have been of an issue that is there. An issue that it comes back eventually, and all the groups of voice teachers, and I will show you an article from The Guardian of some time ago when I was still in Italy. In here, Seth Riggs proposes something about. I'm taking the occasion to talk about something that I encounter in my profession. It is the reason I presented at PVOC 14 conference about, and it has slightly to do with Adele, that I hope is in perfect recovery, because I didn't follow her during the residencies. I didn't take attention to listen well. I heard something slightly, but I didn't really get to listen, and especially I never make a too precise idea if I don't encounter the singer. I have some opinions, I have some ideas, but it will not be professional and serious just to say, yes, of course I can help, what I do can help, if I have not seen the person. They've asked me in London if I had an idea, and not only in London, that I could be of help. I said perhaps, but it depends on what when I meet in person, what I perceive, what I react, etc. Because I have to do from my point of view an assessment with my expertise and my innovation in some sort. So today I'm just taking the case to talk about something. The problem she had is a problem of a not managed encounter with some tension and excess of pressure that can damage vocal cords. It was not nodules, it was a polyp that happens in one episode, and sometimes can happen even with great technique. Usually it doesn't happen because into the system of the voice we have enough mobility to absorb an eventual too much strength, too much pressure. This is what Eric Cressy defines mobility as: the capacity not only of the system to enter the positions desired and required by the task, but to have the capacity to come out without injury and without trauma from the positions not desired that can quite often happen during the task. I say mobility. Some of you will think, okay, we need to be flexible. Here I make a distinction that for me is very important, and I make the case that we have to do this, make this distinction, because it's not clear, and it is a central point in questions like the Adele question, for what I have understood, but it what usually happens in those cases is that flexibility, in my defining in a stricter way, and in a stricter way is the way we progress in making differences, in separating the cases and in separating the questions, because the solutions are very often into viewing better the question. If you don't see the elements composing the question, it's very different that you find a solution, because the solution is in one of those components, or in how those components react one to the other, or how they are related one to the other, or the consequences of one component on the other. And this is true also for us, because we are a dynamic biological system. Flexibility, in my definition, and in some sort it's what functionality is getting to, is a more passive measure. It contains the measure of how you can stretch before damaging. But what you stretch is the muscle, in part, the fascia, that is the layer on the muscle, and this layer, according to its condition, disused, trained, overused, or damaged, and traumatized and inflamed, it gives the possibility of in the muscle to contract, not contract, be damaged by itself. A soreness is the damage you do to the connective tissue related to the muscle. And we are more and more and more saying that can be an occasional thing, even unavoidable, to get to good adaptations, but we don't search for it, and this occasional must be strictly controlled in its measure. It must be strictly controlled in its frequency. It must strictly controlled into its reparation, meaning the recovery. What you stretch, when the muscle can't stretch or the fascia cannot stretch anymore, it will create a tension into the tendon. This tension is going to mobilize the articulation, the joint, moving it. If you go on stretching, you are stretching and you are forcing the ligaments into the joint. And this is quite passive. And also there, stretching is a fantastic tool. Again, we are defining, and functional field, not me, functional field of experts and trainers are defining when it is desirable, when it is maladaptive, and when it is that you don't have to do it. Because from disuse, trained, overtrained, and inflamed, it changed completely the response of the system. When you see the works of Bradsfeld, I'm going to write this name, that is a great researcher, and he published about the effects of stretching loaded within sets of training and the great response they did on trained subjects. When you stretch an unused and untrained subject, you are mostly stretching passively the tissues. And it's not what you want. When I say mobility, in some sort, sometimes can be overlapped in what you think it's flexibility. To me, it's mobility. It is the fact that you can get into a range of motion without passively stretching connective tissue, tendon, and ligaments beyond the capacity of what? Of the muscle and the antagonist, meaning the muscles of the complex, to still produce a work and not only enter this range of motion, but to exit this range of motion. So it means that you never get to the end of range of motion, and you never get to the end of the capacity of the muscle to reverse its action. That is called the plyometric activity. Reversal is the capacity of exiting the position, meaning stopping the activity when it gets into slight trouble because it gets a little too much, and it wasn't the desired, it was the undesired, and still the complex has the capacity to exit it, usually reversing the action. When we sing, I know that very often you have the reductionist idea that we sing by air into the lungs push this air outside, and the vocal folds, they sing. This is an organ pipe with some vocal folds, mean a valve, and some flux of air. Our voice can do many more things than that. It's much more complex. It doesn't mean that this is not true. It means that this is not all. Not all, not true. We have, first, with what are we creating the pressure and the glottis? Just with the lungs, with many other segments of the body. We use those segments to produce a tension that is going to transfer as or posturing and tension of all the body that can sound, because a body without tension cannot sound. You can bring all the pressure you want in the vocal folds. You are going to have a phonation, but it's not going to be singing. You're not going to be able to make a phrase entire. You're not going to be able to make the words. You're not going to be able to make nuances. You're not going to be able to get to the so specific, straight, raw sound of an Adele. Adele has this kind of raw sound that comes from a posturing that is, to me, absolutely physiological, yet it's closer to what can be too much. Closer doesn't mean dangerous in my view. It means closer. When I talked in Tallinn, and I will make an episode on that entire to explain better, but I start now, at PIVOC 14, I said, okay, you have the idea that the joints, meaning the segments of the body, does not interfere and does not contribute into voice production, yet we know that this functions into the segments of the body and the joints even far from the vocal tract and the muscles that usually you think are directly collaborative as a respiratory. Those joints, when they are dysfunctional, have a ratio of this dysfunctionality in the adjacent joints. What it means? It means that if it is yet a dysfunctionality into the lumbar segment, that is this one, in which you have the core, you are going to have directly a limitation and a dysfunction for singing, and it's known. This limitation and this dysfunction is going to migrate in the time, if not solved, in a ratio that can be even relevant, so you have to take care to account for it, to see if it is relevant or not relevant, to the thoracic segment, and or to the hips, and or what it means. It means that you are going to see this function clear stated in one of the two segments. It's quite clear to me that it migrates also to the other segments, perhaps in a minor quantity than the other, perhaps because you use the other segment less for your activities consistently, and the task of your life or your activities is less demanding on the other, or the other is more functional for many reasons, so resists better. But to me, some ratio of dysfunctionality you are going to find in both. And I think that quite difficult that a biomechanics is going to say that absolutely not the case. Because one joint, another joint, the muscle, the antagonist, the agonist, the antagonist, this joint is in common with the other. So if in the complex in which you don't have just one muscle, because some joints have a lot of muscles, a lot. So this is just one part, but there are many, many muscles. If one is not providing completely, is transferring to the position and the possibility of the position of both the joints. How much? Again, it depends on what you're doing. Yeah. But for singers, since our larynx is into the neck yet is smaller, but the larynx is very, very small, I think that any ratio of transferring there can be relevant just only for the fact that the dimensions of the muscles and of the forces involved that are going to transfer are much bigger in the below joints of the body. So what is the point that I'm making? I'm making that if you have a segment that has a problem of, for me, Adele presents a problem of asymmetry. I have this idea, it's my opinion, okay? And I say that because I very often work on the access of asymmetries into the body for singers, because we are two put together in some sort. In some more relevance than other, if you see some horizontal stabilizers are not exactly two, but the diaphragm has two lobes, and we can feel the difference into the work in one of the other, the difference in contribution. Why I'm making the case of the asymmetry? Because into the asymmetry, right side, left side, you have to imagine that if I produce a force in here, I'm moving a joint, and I'm starting to act on the precedent, on the below, and the upper one. In here, I can have this joint that has slight less mobility, meaning that I push with the muscles, they do that. This one cannot anymore, this can. It is going to force more on one side than on the other. The side that cannot more is going to be on the upper, where the force is going to transmit more. It is going to, transfer more tension on one side than on the other. The other side is going to react to this tension at a certain moment dysfunctionally because it can't produce that work anymore. And this, in my theory and vision, it's something that the body does in all the segments, not only in the vocal tract and in the posturing of the larynx, but it does with some very precise logic that to me it's an anti-gravity logic and acceleration logic. It makes the same thing in all the segments because it has dysfunction in all the segments. It doesn't in other because they are not exactly the same functions. But this is get too complicated, and I don't want to get too complicated. What I wanted you to realize is that sometimes if you have one side that cannot produce in some sort the work, you will have a defensive reflex. This is where you find the forcing, and not the absorbing of the other segment into the mobility of the excesses of strength and sometimes of pressure that happens. That's where sometimes you say, I lack flexibility. Now, to me, when it happens, you don't lack flexibility. You are pushing too much into the flexibility of the tissues. You lack mobility. So in my work, when you see my results and when you see why I speak at PVOC, is to say we have to take care where into the segments there is a lack of function provided, so that it doesn't, this segment generally it's a bit asymmetrical, and sometimes it's a lot asymmetrical, cannot provide the same enough mobility for the task, or one side cannot provide the same mobility of the other side. And this is where start seeing that can be seen. It will become larger, I think, in some time. So what is the point? The point is that you can think, as I've started thinking to better explain this thing, and I've seen that probably is the best way, that the voice is a system using parts of your body and functions of your body, and your body is in the environment in which the voice can operate. This environment can be of a sort for which, by the fact that you sing, by the fact that when you're training to sing a lot, you get a bit stiffer, that it's a quality, but at the same time can become a fragility. Exactly when you're trained. When you're trained, you must regularly deload, otherwise you get overtrained. So the thing is, those kind of accidents can happen if you're overloading all the time without giving the recovery time, or if you have an unsolved asymmetry that gets relevant when you are so trained that you're really giving everything every time, and you are more at risk for overtrain. I hope I have not lost you. So even if I've lost you a bit, just start thinking. You put a force, this force is done everywhere in the body. If one side of the body, it will stop and you will have a reflex. And with this reflex, you lose the mobility ability. And it becomes this force and this axis of force taxing the flexibility. And sometimes you exceed the flexibility of the tissues. That's why, for me, we never sing on flexibility, we sing on mobility. Have a nice week. See you next week.